Taking elements and ideas from a game or genre to another can often translate to a better, bigger, and more interesting build game. More often than not, that's how the great video games and sometimes even genres are created, and very rarely we get truly unique design ideas. This, however, requires a delicate balance. A tip too much to one side, and it can be seen as a clone. Tip too much to the other, and can feel rather hollow. Darksiders 1 was already known for taking ideas out of popular titles like God of War, Devil May Cry, and weave it in with Zelda-like elements such as the dungeoneering or the world. But its themes and lore and overall presentation and take on those same elements allowed it to stay within that balance and can be seen wholeheartedly as its own thing. It's able to stand on its own perfectly. Darksiders 2 in turn decided to improve upon all of that, but by adding even more genres, even more elements from other games and mix them all together in an even bigger pot. Did it tip the balance way too far, or did it break it altogether? Let's find out. First, we need to tackle its world, and I'm gonna be pretty rough with the game, but if you saw my earlier take on the original Darksiders, you know how much I love the series, so don't worry, I'll gush about the sequel as well in time. So, the world. It was the biggest and most evident change when you first get into Darksiders 2 from the original, and following the trend of many games, it decided to go on the more open-ish world route instead of the connected but somewhat open levels of the previous game. Basically turns the two worlds that we have here into the Ashlands. This brought two main things. One allowed you to ride your horse, Despair, from the start, which was cool. It made the world feel bigger, the riding mechanics and animations were decent, our horse looks badass as ever, and for God's sake, we are a horseman. It makes sense, and it is awesome.
This is no place for a horse. 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 This is no place for a horse.
5 minutes later.
The other was exploration. The world was bigger, so it makes logical sense that we can go off the beaten path and explore things. And yes, that is true to some extent, but when you truly look at Darksiders 2 world outside of its dungeons, it's fairly inconsequential, lifeless, and awfully linear, which is strange because it is a much bigger world. At first, yes, you get to find small locations, or collectibles, or optional dungeons, 2 or 3 of them, that you can explore, solve its puzzles, platforming sections, like it's traditional from the series at this point, and get some rewards in the form of chests. Even having those Metroidvania-like elements where you need to backtrack later on once you acquire some item or tool, ability to bypass some obstacle. But at the same time, all these optional areas or points of interest around the world don't feel that organic to explore, and more often than not, you're just walking through corridors that branch out of your hub in this semi-open world-like environment. In the original, we had this very same layout of the world branching out from a central point, the Samael place. It wasn't as large or as wide, but was far more cohesive and interesting, with these smaller open areas with chests and hidden secrets. It felt natural when it started opening up to you during your journey. It truly felt like you were exploring this post-apocalyptic world and the impact these universal forces had on it. Take this example that I made in my earlier review. The very first dungeon that you are tasked to get to is the Twilight Cathedral. To get there, you don't just walk through a simple path like it is in Darksiders 2. No, you're going to continue exploring whatever zone you are in this destroyed city. You're going to find secret areas along the way. They are not necessarily dungeons, but you kind of weirdly feel like you are in one, till you reach a sequence where you ride an angelical mount. You play through it till you reach the sad cathedral, all intimidating on its own. But when you get there, you don't just see the dungeon. You see a path that will lead off to a whole other area, but you cannot get there quite yet because you lack a grapple of some kind. You see a blocked area by ice that once again you cannot access just yet. And then you have the dungeon that you enter without a meaningful or intrusive loading screen. You just enter and off your way to explore it. Another example is when you come upon a lake on your way to Ulthane, which will lead off to your second dungeon. All these areas that you're going through, they are not a dungeon. They are simply zones, levels that you're going through to reach your objective. Yet, you encounter all these little secrets, loot, chests, and areas for you to explore, deep underwater, or all in around the building, or chests that you cannot access just yet due to a lack of a grapple, or a barrier to some location that you cannot fathom yet. And all this happens organically, as you're just going through the game, in between all the dungeons. But in Darksiders 2, it's almost like you are in this car on a theme park, and you just ride on these corridors, on these rails, and through them you're going to see little areas, little attractions that you can go in, do some platforming really quickly, just 10 minutes or so, and get some chests, maybe one or two. You might see some locked doors, you see some enemies scattered, and then you run the set corridor to the dungeon door, to your main attraction, where your quest will take place without thinking much of anything. There's no sense of wonder, of mystery in its world exploration outside of the dungeons. This is seen more evident in the two bigger zones, the Forge Lands and the Kingdom of the Dead, where basically every main quest is done through the dungeons. So you will have this routine of getting from point A to point B, from point A to point C, on these corridors, to your dungeon entrance, to your dungeon objective, and you don't feel like you're exploring this game world naturally, but instead on this very calculated or formulaic path where nothing really happens outside of the carefully placed enemies and optional points of interest, and then eventually your main attraction, the dungeon, like a car on a theme park. Honestly, I would have rather that the game had stayed with the same layout of the original instead of these small pocketed experiences, meaning the dungeons. They are great when analyzed in isolation, but the game became too instanced, the world too disconnected from its dungeon counterparts, as that was the only places that really mattered for the story and where practically 90% of your gameplay took place. And in the original, one amazing thing that it had is that it was able to blend the dungeons with the world perfectly. They felt part of each other. They felt just as one thing, and it was capable of creating a journey, an adventure as you went through the world into the dungeon, and from the dungeon into the world, and vice versa. But here, it feels disjointed, like it's two different games almost. However, Darksiders 2 had one big positive in all of this, in its world design, and that was on its aesthetics. Keeping with that exaggerated cartoony look where everything is big and bulky, but far more vibrant this time around, with a bigger dash of Shadow of the Colossus and Zelda. The original was stuck within the confines of Earth, and though they did an amazing job at blending angelical and demonic themes into that post-apocalyptic atmosphere to create these really fantastical areas and zones, these really dilapidated zones, Darksiders 2 takes place outside of Earth, for the most part, in other planets and dimensions, not only branching out the lore even more, but also meaning that we have the most aesthetically impressive looking worlds of the series, where the developers went crazy. Just as the game starts when you are placed at this icy zone, the Icy Veil, I believe. It's honestly breathtaking. The fidelity of it might not be that impressive, even for its time. But the art alone carries the game forward, along with its amazing and perfectly fitting soundtrack. And that fight with War on the prologue, man oh man, perfect introduction to the game. Once we leave the Icy Vale, the Forge Lands is the first zone introduced to us, and here it invokes those feelings of a classic fantasy-like zone, but with some Celtic themes going with the makers, the creatures of the stone, and amazing lush landscapes, for the most part, as there is corruption everywhere. The eerie Kingdom of the Dead, of course, is very fitting to our character, but also the most unique looking, with amazing and haunting set pieces, minus Murghul style, with some Lovecraftian influences. To the smaller and almost dungeon-like Lost Light and Shadow's Edge, equally stunning on their own right, with the Kingdom of Samael as such a badass looking zone. I'm a sucker for demonic looking architecture, Doom-like, so Shadow's Edge was right up my alley.
Do you blame me for hiding? You are death. Where you ride, no one is safe. Not even your mother.
All these zones are simply phenomenal to look at, and they are downright memorable as well, even with their gameplay issues previously stated. It's a gorgeous facade. But where the game does best in terms of level design, and where you'll spend most of your time, as I said, it's not in its open world, as that would be a very bad game indeed. It's the set Zelda-like dungeons that I briefly mentioned. Now, I have a sort of love and not hate per se, but more like could have been better relationship with the dungeons found in Darksiders 2. Simply put, they're super entertaining, they're fun and interesting. They were made far more common, they really double down on them, but they also feel less meaningful and memorable for the sake of quantity, with a few standouts in comparison to the original game. And once again, how disconnected they feel from the rest of the world. I really hate that. That said, the Prince of Persia-like platforming with the ever so convenient wood beams and poles are really fun. Even with some clunkiness with the camera and controls at times, they were still an improvement over the original game platforming mechanics. They're quick, they're straightforward, they make sense for Death as a character since he's all agile over the more slow, brute approach of war, and in certain sections they add a nice space to the overall dungeoneering and puzzles, and this rising feeling in you when there's some awesome soundtrack in the background and you climbing something really cool like that undead ship thing. And the puzzles, they're not gonna wreck your brain, but they are compelling enough to keep you interested and engaged, though that will be subjective really, and more about them in a bit, because the overall dungeoneering and essentially how the game progresses isn't paced all that well. For the first 8 to 10 hours or so, you spend all of your time in the Forge Lands and the Deadlands. Okay, you're going through a vastly different number of dungeons all spread around these corridors, right? The theme park. The Forge Lands dungeons puzzles are gonna start with what you would expect from a Darksiders game. Pressure plates, bombs, lots of balls, lever pulling, and platforming. Standard even for adventure-like games. Just the balls and bombs are pretty much a staple of Darksiders at this point. It loves those. But though the game varies the puzzles, they also can come off as a little formulaic. Because, just like the open world, where you can feel like you're just going from point A to point B through the corridors, you can also feel that the majority of the dungeons and subsequently quests that you go on all fall into doing the same things. Doing a bit of puzzles, a lot of the times for a key or some object, doing a bit of platforming, and doing a bit of fighting. The game switches the order around and switches the puzzles around, but the fundamentals of the quests that you do, the dungeons that you do, mostly stay the same. You obtain tools like the ability to maneuver the ballstone creatures or the hook gauntlet to change some things up, to give you access to new areas, but for hours on end, puzzles and the general dungeoneering formula remain the same, getting to a point where it can feel a little bit tiresome and induce feelings of fatigue. In the Kingdom of the Dead, some new challenges are introduced, and eventually you get the ability to control some undead minions or the lantern puzzles, but even then the game feels like it was stretching its dungeons way too much, almost to a point of filler. An example I vividly remember is when you try to get the Judicar on the Lord of Bones side, and you literally go to 3 mini dungeons inside this one dungeon, okay, to get souls, with challenges that are all similar to one another, with the same formula, but shifted around. Later on or before, you do the same, but in an arena in getting these 3 crystals. In the Forgelands, you do the same, but for stones for the rock giant. Now, all of this would have been fine if variety was there. Like the original, you also had sections where you had to go to 3 different locations in this same dungeon, farming these 3 mini dungeons. But there, you never felt like you were doing the same things, the same puzzles, the same kind of platforming. The game didn't get to a point where it stopped being fun, though I could understand some people perceiving it as it being boring or repetitive and quit during the Forgelands or even during the Deadlands, which is really sad because there's amazing things after this. But it did, however, got to a point you feel you going through the motions. And when a large part of your game is dungeoneering with puzzles at the core of it, I mean, the game is all about dungeons. More variety, a different take on, say, a dungeon would have been much appreciated. That's why I feel that Vigil Games was stretching the game, adding this almost filler-like content to have a longer single-player experience, because it can be a lengthy game, up to 15 hours or so, by just doing the main things, depending on your difficulty, and up to 30 or more if you want to complete it all, or if you want to do New Game Pluses. What's weird about it is that when you get to the City of the Dead dungeon, the last one in that specific zone, the game opens up. It gives you a new entire ability, the Soul Splitter, which can be incredibly creative and fun, essentially giving you the ability to self-play co-op, and the things you do really takes imagination, creativity, and again, it's really fun to do. I love this one bit later on where I'm just playing a ball bomb with myself to blow up some barrier, or using the stone farm death gets farmed in and use my clones to bypass barriers. I mean, it's a really fun and great mechanic and tool. So why get it so late into the game? Not only that, the level design in the City of the Dead, the level design of the dungeon, got far more complex and intricate, much like Darksiders 1, where verticality mattered more. It feels more interconnected, with more to explore and more hidden chests, giving vibes of, again, the predecessor, while most of the earlier dungeons felt much more linear and simple. And in the City of the Dead, I did get lost a couple of times. I did have to wander and look at the map and see where I needed to go. And after going through the weird level on Earth, where the game felt like a zombie horde mode and giving me some Borderlands vibes for some reason, it's a really cool level, by the way. It's really simple and dumb level, but it's really cool. The Angel Dungeon of Lost Light is amazing. And you get the Portal Gauntlet, again from Darksiders 1, so now you get the Soul Splitter, and you get portals. The game got so much more fun in terms of puzzles, platforming, and exploration. I mean, you can now throw objects from one clone to another through a portal. How awesome is that? I was actually scratching my head at times to try and figure all these puzzles out. And sure, it's a Portal ripoff, like the original. But it worked. It worked great. And then you go to the Demon Kingdom of Samael, and you get all of that, plus time travel, and induces even more creative puzzles, even more complex. The level was so complex at times, it was really hard to keep track of everything that was happening while you were doing the puzzles, and each puzzle connected with different times of this dungeon. So it got so much more fun, it got so much more creative, but it's only used in this small single dungeon. Why are these awesome gameplay elements hidden towards the end of the game and the DLCs? The original Darksiders, on the other hand, immediately throws at you interesting, and complex dungeons. I mean, you can just look at the layout comparisons of the first dungeons here. I mean, in the first one, you're going down and up with their vertical design. You're going to be backtracking. You're going to see areas that you cannot access yet, leaving you wondering. You have puzzles where you don't expect, fights that not only take place in a predictable, battle-gated area, but also throughout your exploration. There's also more variety and far more tools to deal with the environment, as you get a new tool with every single dungeon that you go in. And the puzzles are also far more varied, and they're going to change up a lot as you progressively advance through the game, as you progressively go through the dungeons. Every dungeon is completely different from one another, giving it a fantastic pace. But the pace of Darksiders 2 is just off, and I could only describe it as if you were running, right? You were in the forest lines, everything is going good, then you got tired, the dungeons start getting repetitive, and then sped up a bit once you go to the Deadlands, and then you got tired again because it's just doing the same things, but then sped up because you got the Soul Splitter, then sped up even more because you got to Lost Light, and even more because you got to the Samiel's Kingdom, and then it ends. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. It should speed up smoothly, not drag along at times, and speed up at the end, where all the awesome things are hidden in those last 5 hours out of 15 hours. The only explanation I can find is that they wanted to stretch the game for as long as possible. Maybe for lack of development time, considering it only came out 2 years after the original, which is crazy, as the game as a whole was quite a big undertaking, and maybe it needed to meet some quota. It's also funny because the later half of the game with Lost Light and Shadow's Edge, since these zones just serve to house its respective dungeons and are accessed through the instanced portals at the Tree of Life, the game's minimal open world exploration is just gone. It became linear. You just enter this world, you go through the dungeon, you're gonna fight bosses, you're gonna do the puzzles, you're gonna do the platforming, and that's it. And it was awesome, but it also felt off because just before you added these open worlds to run around, sort of.
What defines a soul? Some call it the spark within that fights the darkness, that burns for life itself. But what of death, who became the Reaper on the day he slaughtered the Nephilim? He killed his brother, his comrades, and Absalom.
Now, moving away from all of that, from all the dungeons, all the level design, there's the story and lore. The stretching of the game, if you will, it doesn't harm it too much, but it does ramp up far more in those later levels as well. So at least it's consistent there, but overall the lore was really expanded upon from the original. The Well of Souls and the Tree of Life became a really big part of this universe, and thus deviates a bit from the biblical apocalypse themes that were so cool in the original, to tell more of these fantasy universal story. I mean, they couldn't stay within the apocalypse type theme on Earth forever, so it had to go on these fantasy-like themes at some point. But it really delves deep with all these forces, like, corruption, destruction, balance, creation. And this will be subjective, but for me, I always found Darksiders lore and world fascinating and written fairly well. It has a very unique mystique feel to it that compels you, especially with the art style used here, and makes me want to learn more and be part of this world more. But it also likes to add those gotcha moments, those twists that the original did so well with Abaddon. And here we have that once again with the Archon character, the angel, and with the identity of corruption in being a fellow Nephilim, Absalom. That plays really well with the overall storyline being told about death. And by the way, the fact that the game also tells you what's been going on in the story every time you load up is also really appreciated, and something that every game should add as an option, to be honest. It's amazing. In general, characters weren't as memorable as the original, in large part due to the fact that we go all over the place, so we don't really have enough time to be with the same characters. They come and go, besides the Crow Father and Corruption, the villain. But overall, the best part of the story told in Darksiders 2, and its main focus, really, is the struggles of death as a character, and I think it was handled pretty goddamn well. It felt almost like an anti-hero, much like War, and he also had his own eternal battles, outside of the physical battles we go up against. He had tons of baggage that haunted him and that physically manifested on his body, the souls of his lost kin, the Nephilim. And the game conveys all of that through the writing and dialogue with the characters we encounter extremely well, with those really great one-liners that the series is kind of known for doing.
It is not safe here, for all flesh or for stone. There is no shame in turning back.
No point either.
Personally, I cared far more about Death as a character than I did for War. War was a badass, but Death is not only a badass, but he has all the signs of a complex and troubled character, and everything about the game and story, be the villain, corruption, as a physical manifestation of his choices and past actions, or the ultimate quest to save War and in turn humanity and what must be done to achieve it, made him a whole lot more interesting, all the while living with this almost regret or shame for being the kinslayer. Though he tends to hide that and his other emotions behind his mask, the amazing voice actor can still convey all these sad emotions perfectly. Even the soundtrack was often lamenting. It was like everything around him, and subsequently the game, was a reflex of his own self, and that often tends to be the theme of Darksiders' storylines. War, to an extent, as he was fighting against what he represented, and Fury as well. The stories tend to be a big, ironic metaphor for what each horseman represents. I mean, death must die to resurrect humanity and free War. It cannot get more ironic than that. But my favorite bit, by far, was this one line delivered at the end.
I've killed Absalom. Stopped the corruption. I stand at last at the Well of Souls, with no idea what I must do next.
That line alone said a lot about Death as a character. His firm beliefs and blind will, his loyalty to his brother and fellow horsemen, but it also translated to an almost fourth wall breaking moment. Often, when we get to the end of a game, when we finish a game, we can feel this feeling of, now what, right? Of emptiness, of unknowing. It just ends. And Death felt that way exactly. But when he realized what had to be done, his mask came off. No more regret, no more clinging to the past, no more bullshit. Let's do the right thing. Let's save War. And the more I think about Death and his story and what it all meant, the more I love it. It's almost poetic. Goddamn, man. Now, there's much more about the game besides the Zelda-like engineering. We got combat and its RPG elements, and combat got somewhat improved from the original. It got smoother, snappier, every animation made the game overall more responsive and tighter. And the idea to dual-wield scythes and a secondary weapon that changed movesets depending on the weapon type was also great. It gave you some more variety in the combat in comparison to War. The weird dashes from War became rules, so evading became a bigger but also more enjoyable part about the combat, since they were much smoother to do, and they could also be combined into your moves, and if you can time it right, gave off some cool effect rewarding your skill. Though blocking is now part of your secondary weapon, the bucklers I think, and not something that is baseline, which does make those skillful plays of the original not as prevalent, though you have these on the dodges now. Camera, though improved, still didn't provide a toggle lock-on system, so having to lock on and use a wrath power for an example could still prove to be clunky on a controller, as in I don't have that many fingers, especially since you moved around so much. You had to rely on the lock-on system far more than the War playstyle. But in general, combat is like many other aspects of Darksiders 2. It's really great to look at, it feels decently good, it's flashy, it's pretty, it feels impactful, the combat feel, the feedback of the combat is great, the sounds, visual effects, but it's still missing that thing that makes a hack and slash combat never get boring. Moves are still relatively easy to perform, with not much more to learn beyond a few button presses. And though there was a variety of secondary weapons, they also share pretty much the same level of combos, of moves, with a few different special effects, like a block or a quick slicing attack, or just a big slam with a huge mace or axe when you hold the respective key. The execution mechanic was also toned down, which was a very good decision overall. We still got the pistol and a grapple, but there's still not a lot of room to grow as a player, not a huge skill ceiling to achieve, as most of your abilities and combos were relatively easy and simple to perform, to a point that after 10 hours or so of playtime, it can start getting a little bit fatiguing. Take this comparison that I made with Darksiders 1 as well to further emphasize what I mean by the game's lack of a high skill ceiling, or rather, meaningfulness to try and achieve it, to try and get better at the game. And for that, I need to show you some footage of an actual, really amazing player. And just like War, Death faces the same problem. We are once again met with a hard, limited combo counter, a meter. No matter how skillful you are, the game simply does not flow as well as some of the best hack and slash games out there, like Devil May Cry or Bayonetta, etc., not allowing for those crazy and insane long combos and high streaks, as they break quite easily, as you can see. And just like Darksiders, we are met with again a lot of repetition of moves in order to even try and reach those set high combos that ultimately isn't very fun. On top, there's still no meaningful or fulfilling reason, outside of some legendary weapons effects and personal achievement, to even try to get those very high combo streaks. No feedback, no sound effect, no visual effect, nothing to really pump your adrenaline mid-combat to reward you outside of the bland counter and, well, damage numbers. Though at the same time, this is pretty easy to break in a game, and once you get the Whirlwind ability, your streaks just skyrocket for literally pressing a button, removing some of the satisfaction of earning that high combo meter, leading to the average player to mash buttons and do the respective tactics for bosses or enemies, and not push it much beyond that, as it will be good enough. Which continues to be unfortunate in the series. I don't want my Darksiders game to be a Bayonetta or a Devil May Cry, mind you, but it just needed some extra spice, some extra flavor outside of just being fun. But where Darksiders 2 lacks depth or complexity, it makes for features in spades, and that's where it drew even more ARPG elements by presenting a skill tree. But just like the rest of the game, the combat rather, it's really straightforward, mostly passive abilities and 4 main abilities for each respective branch. Harbinger or Necromancy, though contrary to War, we can draw many cool thematic abilities from Death, like summoning ghouls or crows or getting in Reaper form as a oh shit button, so that alone made you look forward to certain abilities, like your Harvest ability to boost all of your damage, or your ghouls as a distraction, but they are all pretty simple mechanics, nothing that will change your gameplay too much to the likes of a typical ARPG. But like the combat, there's not a whole lot of incentive to really dig deep in build making, unless you really, really love the game. But that ties in with the gear system and stats, because if we have a skill tree, we also have a more traditional RPG progression. And systems, like a dialogue wheel to learn more about the world or get side quests, which, is what it is. And instead of using exploration and the environment to improve your character through the discovery of chests, secrets for shards, souls, and upgrades, Metroidvania style, here was a skill tree, moves that you can buy, gear, and stats. And your combos, the moves that you could buy with gold, with coins, also felt kinda meh to get. Not only because there weren't a lot of meaningful ones, a lot of interesting ones, but because gold, coins, is really easy to come by just selling all the crap that you get. In Darksiders 1, at the beginning at least, there's a lot of decision making when it came to building your war character. There were a lot of combos and upgrades to the set combos, but required souls. You could also get a secondary weapon, the scythe, and an upgrade to that scythe, but it would also cost souls. And its combos as well. Your wrath ability is the same, along with consumables. So your currency mattered a whole lot more, and overall felt far more satisfying and meaningful to get new toys in Darksiders 1. You would even plan around them to get what you wanted, as it's typical from the genre. Here, simply feels like it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you make a wrong choice. It doesn't matter how expensive it is, because you will be able to get gold rather quickly. Plus, gold, coins, feels so wrong after the souls currency. I mean, why coins? Then you have the gear system, which is not often found in hack and slash action games, so a lot of the rules change. Your HP and wrath aren't as unique as a previous game, uses your run-of-the-mill HP and mana, which is boring, and the overall gear or armor, the same. You have a lot more than just 2 to 3 weapons of Darksiders of war, but you don't care as much. The customization side of things was cool. The gear, like every aspect of the art of the game, is great, so you can almost do a Fashion Siders kind of thing. I for sure did it. And the gear drops are plenty, so it feels like a Diablo loot game, where you're constantly getting new and better gear. But the problem is that you don't really care that much about it, and you pretty much look at whatever has the bigger numbers or has the flashier colors, like epics, possessed, or boss gear, and equip that. Besides secondary weapons where you might have a preference in its movesets. There are cool stats that give nice feedback in combat, like wrath or health steal, like the crow scythes, allowing you to use tons of rat powers, or elements like ice that can stun enemies and can have some effects on creatures of the opposite element. But for the most part, stats isn't something heavily emphasized in the game. It's just there because it looks cool, can have some cool effects, and add some extra sense of progression and some short-term excitement. That's how it feels to me, and while like many aspects of the game, it can be fun, but lacks meaningfulness. And sure, you can create builds. You can find hardcore fans that have all these setups and have played the game for hours on end and on higher difficulties that you can unlock with the new game pluses. And you can do things like, say, focus on arcane stats that boost ability damage, wrath abilities, with, say, a weapon that has tons of wrath steal. So now you can do tons of wrath powers and have them do really high damage. Or focus a lot on strength with the Harbinger build and just hit really hard with your normal attacks with all those crits and damage benefits from the Harvest ability. But realistically, since gear is so randomized for most players that are just gonna pick up the game, play once and never really play it again, you equip whatever has the prettier numbers and you roll around and kill stuff. Sometimes less can be more, and the more traditional approach to Darksiders worked far better than its RPG elements and randomized gear loot system, which consequently lessened part of the exploration. Seeing chests in the original was always an awesome feeling, be shards or a piece of armor or an enhancement or even souls. But here was just RNG, outside of chests that can contain a map, a dungeon map or something. So there's a big chance you don't get anything good, and if you did get something good, it only satisfied you in a moment because you're gonna switch that piece of gear in the next hour or so, lacking in that nice long-term achievement feeling that lasted you until you finished the game, and even beyond. Now, to finish off, I also wanted to tackle the boss battles, and they still kept with the idea that mindlessly attacking won't really get the job done, and often there's a little strategy in order to defeat the boss. Some a little bit gimmicky, like the spider boss early on, with the balls akin to the spider boss in the original, but others that were really fun, like the Shadow of the Colossus-like battle with the Stone Guardian, where you have to slowly tear him down and avoid his super dangerous attacks in this big battlefield, where you can ride your horse, really making you feel like a proper horseman defeating this gargantuan creature, with an amazing soundtrack, by the way. Even those bosses that were just hacking and slashing away, now that the game had a better dodging mechanic and a better evade mechanic, hacking away at the boss and perfectly dodging attacks like, say, the Echidna or Archon, which was a really cool fight, along with Samael, which was actually a rather challenging fight and I believe the hardest fight in the game. So due to the dodging mechanic alone, it made all those fights really enjoyable and even interesting in learning their attack patterns and what's the best way to avoid them. They were nothing too crazy hard or complex like some other games in the genre, but like the rest of the game, they were quite fun and entertaining. So to round all of this up, this new direction that Darksiders 2 took, everything that was added made the game a little bit bloated. The pot was overfilled and whatever came out of it still looked and tasted great, but the essence, or better put, depth, it was indeed missing when it came to gameplay. Systems were added over the already borrowed systems and mechanics and elements, but they were just done on a surface level. Its aesthetics, presentation, the feel of the combat, some of its dungeons, and anything to do with audio and lore still held up the game very high, to still have that nostalgic feeling for all of us to remember the series fondly, like the original. And it's one of those games that you might see some small asset and you can immediately pinpoint that's a Darksiders game. It may be a jack of all trades and master of none, with the biggest Wikipedia description of a game that I can realistically remember, but was still one hell of a ride, and one that I still remember quite fondly and vividly from my first playthrough years ago as just a fun game with very cool lore. And yes, it lost some identity in its gameplay by trying to do so much, and honestly not exactly the sequel I was expecting. A simple polish on the original formula would have been enough, and the reason why I compared the two so much. But it was still able to create a very entertaining experience that made you think a little bit with the characters involved in the game, like Death. And it had a great amount of content to go through, and tons of flashy and cool things to keep you interested. It may not surpass the original in some ways, but we have to commend the overall undertaking of wanting to improve and innovate upon the original Darksiders formula, even with all of its faults and such little amount of development time. If you can resonate with it all, if you can see it for what it is and play it on a very surface level, and just admire the journey that the game is presenting to you, it will be yet another great Darksiders adventure and a beautiful expansion to this fantastic universe.